From TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jarod Duggins, and this is the Careers in Cannabis podcast. On this show, we speak with staffing agencies, cannabis companies, and seasoned traditional market executives in order to obtain a better grasp of the current employment climate and what we might be able to expect of our burgeoning cannabis industry. On this episode, we dive a bit deeper into the reality of what the cannabis industry really needs, and that's more good people. Today's guest relates her journey through some traditional market jobs and even a venture into owning her own business, and how those experiences have proven indispensable as she made her switch into a growing and sometimes unsteady cannabis industry. If you're considering a career change or have been thinking about trying to enter the cannabis industry, you definitely want to stay tuned. We are joined today by Caroline Yeh, Director of Procurement for Kiva Confections, a leading brand in the cannabis space. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. First of all, I wanted to check in. We are definitely amidst a global pandemic. How have you been doing over the last few months now?
I am in a very fortunate situation where I can work full time from home. So, it hasn't been easy working in isolation. However, I certainly consider myself one of the lucky ones who has been able to pretty much maintain a fairly regular schedule, and I just do it from home.
That's fantastic to hear. And, by and large, most of us participating in the cannabis industry, after having been deemed essential and having the ability to go to work, I think fit in that category. But realistically, being able to work from home, that's another blessing in and of itself, right? Today, Careers in Cannabis, we're checking in with you as a industry professional, someone that, as we've detailed in the intro, is the Director of Procurement for Kiva Confections. And you come from the food industry, but you didn't really end up directly at Kiva. So can you tell us a little bit about your past and where you started and how you got to Kiva?
It was through a rather circuitous route. Certainly did not expect to end up in cannabis at any point early in my career. So as an undergraduate, I majored in history and environmental studies, but I had a passion for food, which is why I ended up working in a kitchen. And my first professional job was working in New York City at a restaurant called Gotham Bar and Grill. And from there, I actually got kind of tired of working in a kitchen. It's very, very hard physical work. So I ended up moving up to Boston, where I got an interest in chocolate. And I ended up opening my own chocolate business at the age of 25. And I ran a retail store for 2 years called Tempered Chocolates, which was in the Hotel Commonwealth in Boston. However, being a Californian, born and raised in California, we often come back to California. So after about 10 years on the East Coast, I actually came back to California, and I moved to the Northern California area. And the first job that I got here was at Charles Chocolates. And I actually had sold this brand in my store that I owned in Boston. And so essentially from there, I spent about 10 years working at various startup food companies based here in the Bay Area. A lot of small companies, 2 of them were actually where I was the first employee, so very, very much a startup. And after a few years, I decided that I wanted to get my MBA. So I went to Haas. I got my exec MBA at Haas. And the nice thing about being in a school environment is the opportunity to explore things that you otherwise, might not risk doing. And being at Haas gave me the opportunity to look at what other industries that were growing, that were fast, that were challenging, but that could be applicable to my skills. And that's when I became really interested in cannabis. I spent, my last year in school doing a lot of work, researching cannabis, even thinking about owning my own cannabis edibles business. But ultimately, when I finished school, I decided that it was such a new industry that I didn't want to take the risk myself. So the first job I got in cannabis was at Bloom Farms, which at that time, and I still think it is, one of the top 20 cannabis businesses here in California. And after 2 years at Bloom Farms, I moved on to Kiva Confections, where, as you stated earlier, I am now the director of procurement.
That is an illustrious beginning to a career in cannabis. As you stated before, with weighing the risks and benefits of coming into a youthful industry such as the cannabis industry, we call it the burgeoning cannabis industry because it's kind of finding its place at the table here amongst recreational activities, if we'll call it that, as well as medical value and research and science being produced from that. With your background, as far as being a small business owner and then on into some more established brands, how much do you think your past experience plays into this? Or, is it just kind of like everyone states, the wild, wild west? What do you think your background lends to? Does it help you out or is it just kind of like a free for all, in your opinion?
Oh, no, I couldn't do this without my background. So the first thing I'll state is, what I kind of realized after entering cannabis is that I have a very high tolerance for risk, and that's not true of everybody. So having started my own business at 25 and then working at quite a few startup businesses, I would say that many people may not be that willing to absorb that amount of risk, go more into a traditional industry. And I think that very much applies to cannabis too. Particularly earlier in my career, when we were still a medical market and we had not gone rec in California yet. So that's one of the things that I've realized both in my past work experience and on a personal level is having that some amount of risk tolerance is actually pretty important if you want to enter cannabis. But I mean, to be quite honest, for me, cannabis is another consumer packaged good. And so my background in food was incredibly important because I could apply the skills and network that I built working in food directly into working in cannabis. And the unique thing I think about cannabis also is because we're a new industry, a lot of times we don't have things that were built for us. We don't have ERP systems that were meant for cannabis. We don't have accounting systems that were built for cannabis. So what we do is we take things and we adapt them for cannabis. And that's where my background really came in handy, was that I was taking packaging vendors, suppliers, things like that I had worked with previously, and I bring them into cannabis with me.
It's quite common. People mention CPG as far as a optimum background to have as far as coming into the cannabis industry. If you're speaking to the audience and talking to someone who's currently in the traditional CPG market space, are there any tips or hints that you could throw their way, so to speak, as far as if they're looking to actually identify a position or starting spot in the cannabis industry?
I would say that just like any company or any industry, there are a lot of places where you can plug in. So you don't necessarily have to have a CPG background. My background is very helpful because I work for Kiva and we produce, a consumer packaged good. But if you go and work for other companies, you'll see very similar things to pharmaceuticals because we work in a highly regulated industry. And people who come from beverage, also alcohol or beverage, they can really understand that background coming from a highly regulated industry. So I don't think you necessarily have to have a CPG background. The reason why it's helpful is because we deal with a lot of similar issues. For me, I'm dealing with the supply chain, I'm dealing with packaging. So, and then you're selling to an end consumer. So there are a lot of similarities that if you can understand that process. But I would say it kind of depends on what role you're looking for. Cannabis is very diverse. So at Kiva, we have an accounting team, a sales team, a marketing team, an operations team, a manufacturing team, a distribution team. That's a lot of places to plug in with a background that, particularly if you're working in marketing, sales, operations, it's great to have a CPG background. Yet I would say it's not totally necessary.
Right. And realistically, all those jobs and positions you just named, it's, in my opinion, it's not even necessary to have any cannabis business related experience either. What would you think about that as far as, those verticals, the accounting and the marketing and that kind of stuff, as far as cannabis related background? Do you think you have to climb the ladder, or do you think ultimately those types of positions you could kind of walk into?
The thing, Jarod, is that cannabis is growing really rapidly, and we're not an established industry in the traditional sense yet. What that means is we have to hire outside of the cannabis business, or else we just don't have enough human beings to staff it, especially human beings with experience, professional experience in sort of parallel industries. So it's actually I would say the vast majority of the people I work with on a director, manager, even an executive level really hadn't been in cannabis prior to joining Kiva. So it's actually pretty rare to find people who are in the industry, in the medical industry prior to, joining a company that's now operating in the recreational field.
Right. Well, and I mean, taking Kiva, for example, as you've mentioned, it's not like they're one of the leading confection companies in California and or moving on a very big rate license-wise. I mean, you've got to look at them as a beacon of success and light here in the cannabis industry. So, the way Kiva's been scaling, I'm not sure how many employees do you have?
I think they're around about 200 right now.
Perfect. Well, and that brings up the other point. We're here to talk about, your transition into cannabis as a career, but within that, are there any positions that you'd like to throw out there for the listeners, or anything that you're doing hiring wise, or any places you could point our listeners to of which they could find the latest and greatest offerings of Kiva?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're listed on our website, kivaconfections.com, under careers. We are currently hiring in multiple departments. I know we're hiring sales, marketing. We're always hiring in our manufacturing and distribution. And one of the things, Jarod, I'd like to say that I really enjoy about cannabis and specifically about Kiva is I've seen the company provide opportunities for people to grow within the ranks. And there are plenty of people who have actually, many of them are cannabis background or bud tenders who've come in or, on the extraction side too. And they've been able to rise and become warehouse managers and operations facility managers. And I've been really impressed by that ability, both at Kiva, but I would say that's actually not uncommon within the cannabis space.
It's great that you brought that up because, Kiva is growing at such an exponential rate, and the scaling does require people who are tried and true within the company to build and grow up with the company. So that gives a tremendous amount of opportunity to the first comers to the industry, the people who are willing to take that risk tolerance into consideration and get here first. And like you said, it's not only Kiva, it's the industry itself, because we're scaling at such a large rate nationally that the human beings, like you said, are the biggest part of what we're lacking to make these scale jumps from state to state and then hopefully on a national level. But yeah, no, thank you for all these intriguing points. You really brought some great insights to the show. I know our listeners are going to value tremendously from it. So with that, Caroline, I'd like to say thank you very much again for joining the show, Careers in Cannabis, and coming in and shedding some light for our listeners to consider. And had they not been considering a career in cannabis before, I hope they are now. Thanks again for visiting.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jarod.
You can follow our series, Careers in Cannabis, as well as more great shows like this one at TRICHOMES.com. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, make sure to reach out. You can reach us at careersincannabis@trichomes.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review, as it really helps others find the show. For trichomes.com, I'm Jarod Duggins. Be well, and thank you for listening.